Jesus is the ultimate sacrifice. It's a human sacrifice, but we don't do human sacrifices in the Ifa tradition. But I'm just putting it in context because there's always this notion that we're doing something evil when we sacrifice animals, but animal sacrifices are outlined in the Bible in the first sorry, in the Old Testament, which is the old covenant or agreement that they had with God. With the ancestors in particular, I do caution people there because you don't always know what ancestors, what spiritual forces you're dealing with. So some people just start calling on all the people from their bloodline and so forth, so on. And all of the individuals who are deceased from our bloodlines are not our ancestors.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Shifting Dimensions podcast. This is a podcast where we explore the unseen, the unknown, and the transformative moments that shift our understanding of reality. I'm your host, Jummie Moses, spiritual seeker and metaphysical investigator, exploring the mysteries of existence. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Asanee Brogan. Dr. Asanee is a spiritual coach and educator specializing in traditional African religions. As the founder of Asanee 44, she's dedicated to teaching and empowering others in African spirituality. With a focus on Ifa tradition, more than just sharing her knowledge, her mission is to help people connect with the ancestral wisdom within their spiritual heritage. Dr. Asanee, welcome to Shifting Dimensions. It's such a pleasure to have you here.
Ashe, same to you. Thank you for having me.
So before we got started, I was telling you about how excited I am about this topic. I feel like I've been looking for someone to come on the show that's an expert in African spirituality. And I know it's vast, and I know today we're probably just going to scratch the surface a little bit, but I'm really excited to have this conversation. And to kick things off, I think it's important to ask if you could share a little bit more about the Ifa tradition for those who may be unfamiliar and what drew you to that specifically.
Okay, perfect. So the Ifa tradition is a traditional African religion whereby multiple spiritual forces are worshipped through various means, doing sacrifices, animal sacrifices, offerings. That's like the more exciting part that people kind of hone in on. But it is a spiritual tradition whereby we honor different spiritual forces in various ways. Is based on a divination system, which is core to Ifa, is understanding the knowledge from Orumila, which is the oracle of the tradition, Olodumare being the supreme creator or God, if you will, which most people would consider in that role. It is not polytheistic, right? So we only worship or serve the high creator being, which is Olodumare. However, we do honor the other spiritual beings, our ancestors, our Ori, our head, which is also a form of an Orisha, and so much more. So, how did I come to it? Is my ancestors, to put it in short, took a spiritual journey that just led me from being into Christianity, and then I transitioned into the understanding of the Hebrew Israelite culture. Then I actually traveled around the world. I lived in different parts of the world. In doing so, I came like really face to face with my spiritual heritage, with my cultural heritage on so many different levels. And I just had this deep level awakening experience and realized that the teachings of the Bible and the interpretations of it more so is was not true, at least not for me, for my particular path. And so started to get different spiritual readings, and they all just kept pointing me back to Ifa. I was told that the tradition was for me, and I wasn't even getting Ifa divination at the time. I was getting other types of readings in which the spiritualists either had like a knowledge of, or it just came through if they were intuitively inclined. When I say a knowledge of, I should say like a deeper knowledge of it. Maybe they didn't full on practice it, but because they were spiritually inclined, they knew a lot about a lot of different traditions, and Ifa being one of the most popular African traditions, especially in the diaspora, it just kept coming through. And so I went on a journey, took a pit stop, pit stop. I shouldn't say stop because I still do honor and practice in the Haitian voodoo tradition, but more so I'm inclined towards Ifa. But I did have a pit stop there into Haitian voodoo because before I went directly into Ifa, my ancestors let me know there was some information that I needed out of the voodoo system because they actually practiced that as well. I did not know that beforehand. And after I did some work in that tradition, I kind of went full blown into the Ifa tradition. And so, again, I practice both, but I lean more towards the Ifa tradition in my business efforts.
So did you grow up Christian? Because you said that as you went on this spiritual journey and you had all these different awakenings and you kept being pointed into the direction of convening with your ancestors, especially through the Ifa traditions. So did you grow up Christian? And what was that like for you when you realized that everything that you had learned was no longer applying to you in a spiritual sense?
So absolutely, yes. Christianity is my background. I can't say like we were like heavily involved in the church. When I was younger, I do remember going to church more so than when I got older. So many different things happened in my household to where I should say my mom really more so than my dad because he wasn't into the church at all in my younger years. He actually converted to Christianity a few years ago prior to his transition to the ancestral realm. But growing up, I did have that foundation and basis in Christianity. We studied the Bible. I had a notion of what it was about. Even so, the irony is, after I left home and right before I met my husband, I started to get into the biblical teachings and church and all of this type of thing. And I met him, and he was heavily into the church. And so we went really deep. I went really deep into Christianity. And that is probably what actually sparked me into transitioning because the deeper you go, the more questions that you have because of so many different discrepancies, right? And I was frustrated and I was like, this can't be true if it's so many questions and I can't get the answers that I need because I'm a deeply spiritual person. I like to know, understand meaning. It's not just about ascension, light, and love for me. It's about understanding the purpose of life, understanding different spiritual dimensions, so forth and so on. And so you asked me how was that transition for me? It was absolutely devastating, right? Because that was a major part of who I was by that time. Because when I did into transition away from Christianity, I was pretty deep into it from my own studies, from my own understanding of it. And so, like, Jesus was my savior, so to speak. And I was being severed from that. So it's not easy. Anytime that you transition from something that you love, something that you believe in, it is not going to be just, oh, well, that's wrong. This is right. I'm going over here. So I went through probably a good year or two of mourning, right? From like, this is not true. And now I got to figure out what is true and lots of confusion, so forth. So, yeah, that was my experience.
I can imagine because everybody says we're spiritual beings having a human experience. And to have such the spiritual foundation of your life be shook, and now you're stepping into this new identity, it's not just mourning what you used to believe in, it's kind of like mourning who you thought you were potentially. So that is a lot. But something that you said earlier that I thought was very interesting is the fact that the Ifa tradition, which comes from the Yoruba tribe, Nigerian Yoruba tribe, if I'm not mistaken, you said it's a monotheistic tradition, which I thought was interesting because a lot of times when I've heard of this tradition and when people talk about African spirituality in general, there's this connotation that it's polytheistic, right? Because it leans very heavily on ancestors and Orishas and all of that stuff. So, can you talk about the spiritual hierarchy within the tradition?
Absolutely. And also to kind of talk about that point about the polytheism, it was deception, right? So everything that we do spiritually, everything that we are as people was turned into something different. So we were made to feel inferior about everything that we are and everything that we do. As far as the hierarchy goes, there is one sovereign creator that is referred to primarily by the name Olodumare. Some people say Ejumare. This depends on where you're from in the region in Nigeria, in particular, like the Oyo State region. But there are some other ones that are heavily inclined to practicing Ifa as well. So below Olodumare would be the Orishas. There is even a hierarchy there, Obatala being like the top, the head Orisha because he's the oldest. And then you have the, what do you call it, your Egbe Harun, your astral mates. And then you also have your ancestors, trying to ensure I'm not forgetting anyone in the hierarchy. But there is a stepped approach to it. So this would be akin to like honoring angels, like in Christianity. And it depends on where you come from in the Christian denominations as well, because Catholicism is very, very heavily, closely related to the hierarchy that we see in Ifa, because there's a belief in one God, Jesus, if you will, depending on what background you are coming from. And then you have the angels, then you have the saints, and even they honor their ancestors as well, right? So it does happen, but we believe in one supreme being, which most people refer to as God. I don't really say God just because God does not mean a sovereign being, as most people think it means. God is simply a divinity, and it could be a divinity at any level. So that's kind of how it's structured.
I like that you said that because I've heard people say something similar as well, that the word God, any sort of supreme being, could be considered a god versus, because again, we think about God as, like you said, a sovereign being, right? Like the ultimate one, higher intelligence, which in this case would be Oludumare, which you said in terms of the spiritual hierarchy, that would be where they stand. And then you have the Orishas who fall underneath that, which I read up on something which they said that Orishas are basically the messengers or the workers for Oludumare, which is the one higher intelligence. And I'm saying God in this sense so that people who are listening can kind of follow along, but they could
They could
also
also.
be considered gods themselves, right? Given within the context in which you just broke everything down. And then you have the Igbeis, which are the astral mates, which I thought that was fascinating because when I read up on that, it kind of sounded like the same rhetoric I hear regarding twin flames, where you have one soul, but they're two souls as one. And some people have their incarnate other half here, and other people have their other half in the spiritual realm. So it kind of sounds similar to that. And then we have the ancestors right underneath them. Correct? That's everything that you said.
Absolutely. And you are correct. That twin flame concept absolutely comes from Egbe. They're more complex than that, so it's not just about a romantic love affair, because your Egbe is like a class of advanced adults and children or what have you. So you will have a spiritual spouse and other companions along that realm. And so your Egbe Arun meaning heaven, those are the ones that are in heaven. We also have earthly mates, right, that are part of our Egbe group. And so they are earthly based. Egbe Ayi, I think is pronounced. I may not be saying it right, but there is a separate group that we encounter here. So there are people that you were meant to meet along your journey. Some will stay with you throughout the entirety of your life. And because your parents could be part of your Egbe group in heaven. But that's not the case for everybody. Not just because you're born to somebody, then they are automatically part of your egg group. But certain friendships, certain connections that you have here on earth. And a lot of people say, like, this is my soulmate, this is my other half. It is a strong potential that that person is part of their egg group, that the class of spirits that they belong to in heaven.
Okay, so it
Okay,
kind of
so it kind
sounds
of
like
sounds like
soul families almost
correct.
from how other people say it. Okay. The
Exactly. I would say exactly. It's a soul family.
Okay,
Hmm.
perfect. And the reason why I was emphasizing everything you just said is because again, when I
When I
hear about
hear
these
about these
traditions,
traditions,
there's a lot of emphasis placed on the ancestors and the Orishas. Those are the two I hear a lot. My first question is, I outside of the hierarchy, what is the difference between the ancestors and the Orishas? And do people who are in this tradition, do they always need to go to them, or can they just go straight to Oludumare, for example, which is the one high intelligence, one true God, I could say.
gotcha.
Yeah.
Very, very good questions. So, in terms of the difference between the Orishas and ancestors, Orishas are actually part of our ancestral group. They're not necessarily part of our direct bloodline. However, they are part of the collective ancestors. But the Orishas are considered forces of nature, right? So they live in us, they live in our environment, and they help us out in different ways. So they can be expressed in the form of water, in the form of air, fire, and so many other aspects of the natural world. As far as and they were said to have lived before on the earth and walked the earth and had different trials and tribulations, and then based on what they went through and based on the ones that we're mostly connected to in our own journey, we're going to have certain aspects that are like them. The ones, especially what we call a head orisha, that's the one that we resonate with the most. And so you'll find a lot of your traits and characteristics to be like that particular energy. Now, when we say ancestors, we're talking specifically about those individuals from our bloodline, those who have now transitioned to the astral realm. And so they actually lived in, some of them we know, some of them we don't know, because some of them were way past before we ever came to the earth. So these forces act in tandem, and even so, like the your Egbe class is also inclusive of some of your ancestors as well. It's a group of so many different types of forces all put together. Some of your Egbe is are the Orisha. Some of your Egbe, because it's a group, are the ancestors and other spirits, right? What was the other question you asked about?
Yeah, so I wanted to know if someone was practicing this tradition, if I was in this tradition, do I have to go to the ancestors and the Orishas as intercessors to Oludumare, the one true God, or can I bypass them and just talk directly to the one true God?
You can I speak to Olodumare, the owl that works with me, my godparent, if you will, in the tradition. He absolutely speaks directly to Olodumare. The difference is that you don't give offerings directly to Olodumare. So you are going to give the animal blood and whatever other materials that it may be required in that particular sacrifice or offering to a specific Orisha. We don't maintain pots or icons for Olodumare, the supreme being, because really everything that we're honoring are aspects of the supreme being, because the supreme being made all. So instead of going directly to him, we make the offerings to his messengers, and then they go and present it. And it's Olodumare that says yay or nay at the end of the day, as far as how that's going to play out. So you don't maintain a pot, an icon, any type of physical representation of the supreme being in the form of that essence being here on the earth. But you can absolutely pray to Olodumare and give thanks and praise. I do, like I said, my owl does, and I've heard a few other people do it as well.
So, what are the situations where somebody would say, I want to go and speak with my ancestors, I want to convene with my Orishas? What are scenarios where people would seek out their ancestors?
Day-to-day life, right? The same way you could think of it as when you pray to Jesus or what have you, if you came from a Christian background, or Allah if you came from an Islamic background, etc. you go directly to them, and you can go to an altar if you have one set up. Now the altar part comes from the diaspora, so I do maintain an ancestral altar, but it's not part of Ifa. It's actually part of the voodoo tradition. So when it comes to working with the ancestors in Ifa, they're going to have the masquerade and other things that are connected to them, but they do have their sacred icons and so forth. But just on the day to day, if you're suffering from something or you need something, or you just want to talk, it doesn't always have to be about a challenge that you're experiencing. You just go and you speak to your ancestors. You can do the same thing when you need to speak to an Orisha. I would say it's primarily intuitively guided. That's what I advise all my clients. If you just feel it in your spirit, for instance, me, Ogun is my head Orisha. So if I just feel like Ogun, we need to have a conversation. So this is what I do. I just talk to Ogun. I talk to all of my spirits every single day though. Like that's a morning ritual for me. That's part of my routine. When I get up and get myself together, I go into my temple and I speak to all of my spirits collectively throughout the day. I may just have an inkling, ancestors, hey, I need to speak to you right now. And we're just talking. It could be just a general conversation. So is for me, and I'm speaking specifically for me because everybody has their own practice. It is just very natural how I do. I just integrated the same way I used to pray. Now, if you're coming from the Yoruba context, you're going to say incantations in the Yoruba language when you're actually feeding and interacting with an Orisha pot. That's a little bit different, but just on the casual, just regular conversation.
Well, a lot of what you're talking about sounds similar to what a lot of people in modern day spirituality call spirit guides and potential angels. Is it too reductive to kind of say that that's what you're talking about here when you're talking about ancestors, Orishas, and even Igbe's, or is it a little bit more nuanced than just thinking of them as spirit guides or angels?
It's definitely more nuanced, but I often put it in that context just so people can kind of have a framework, right? Because even myself, I needed to understand it in the context of what I already knew. As I graduated from that space, I don't need to have that reference, but I understand it when people do need that. So they're not the exact same because there's so many nuances in like the classification. Me personally, my Christian background, I didn't come with a whole lot of understanding of who the individual angels and things like that were. Like I had some sense of the characterization, but I didn't have a deep level knowledge. I didn't have the mythological narratives and things like that. So I wouldn't equate one for one. There's a whole lot of synchronization, especially when you come to it from a lot of the derived traditions, the Ifa derived traditions that we see in the diaspora. So like the Santeria, the Lucumí, Espiritismo, Palo, so forth and so on. Those traditions are heavily synced with Catholicism because of the way slavery played out in the Americas in this part of the world. So you are going to see some people actually substituting or using Catholic saints or imagery and things like that. You see that a lot of in voodoo as well. For those notions, like that's the context that they'll come from because those are the things that they use to kind of hide the traditions in the diaspora. But I don't, it is it's nuanced. I don't want to say it's reductive, but it's nuanced. And I don't think that you can just like automatically just one for one. This is this ain't this is over here like this. A lot of times a lot of people compare the goddess Oshun to Venus being an astrological planet or what have you. And I know that it's more nuanced than that, even though I'll use those analogies myself because it's easier to gain an understanding because more people know about Venus. They understand the traits and things like that. There's so many books that have been written about that goddess. But, to say it's Oshun exact trait for exact trait. It's not that easy. So it's the same kind of situation when it comes to like comparing the Orishas and other spiritual forces to angels and other tiered beings in other spiritual systems.
Right, which makes sense. And speaking about similarities that we were just talking about now, you've mentioned a couple of times the notion of sacrifice, right? And even within the Bible, there are different instances of offering sacrifice to a higher being. I've never really understood the concept of a sacrifice and why that's necessary. But within the Ifa tradition, especially when convening with the ancestors and the Orishas, you talked about, again, for example, the difference between communing with them and communicating with them versus Oludumare, which is the ultimate supreme being that resides over everyone and everything, is offering them sacrifices. What is the purpose of sacrifice? Why is that so important?
But let me say this. So we sacrifice all the time, right? Sacrifice is a part of any and everything that we do. When you're referring specifically to Ebo or sacrifice in the Ifa tradition, where we're shedding the blood of an animal in exchange for whatever we want, it's about balance, employing balance. So you may be off, not maybe, you are off or you're out of balance in some area of your life. And in order to balance yourself, we shed the life force of some animal. So it could be a chicken, a goat, a what do you call it, a dog. It could be so many different types of animal groups in which you're going to shed their blood to bring about balance in whatever you need in life at that time. And it's the same process of any sacrifice that you are going to make. Like so, let's say you want to get a job in a career field that requires you to go to college. So you're gonna have to sacrifice your time. You're gonna have to sacrifice money, energy, right? And so forth and so on in order to get what you want. So it's the same concept there. We use the blood because the blood is quicker. It is the life force. So it acts as a scapegoat. As you mentioned before, the same concept comes in the Bible, which was taken from the African traditions of our ancient ancestors. Those, matter of fact, you go into the book of Leviticus, because it wasn't even just here and there in the Old Testament. There's an entire book that describes what sacrifices should be given to make up for or atone for what sins, right? And the scapegoat was commonly used and talked about in the entirety of the Old Testament, really. And so there was this notion that we're going to give blood, even so Jesus, right? Jesus is the ultimate sacrifice. It's a human sacrifice, but we don't do human sacrifices in the Ifa tradition. But just I'm just putting it in context because there's always this notion that we're doing something evil when we sacrifice animals, but animal sacrifices are outlined in the Bible, in the first, I mean, sorry, in the Old Testament, which is the Old Covenant or agreement that they had with God. And I don't even want to get into why would you have a new one, but that's a whole nother concept there. But you have all of these dynamics that were outlined, and a lot of those sacrifices that were put forth, like I said before, you see the similarities in the sacrifices that we do in Ifa, right? There is outlined that you give this particular sacrifice when this sin has occurred or when that has happened and so forth and so on. And you see a lot of those same dynamics going on within the Ifa tradition because sacrifice is a way of atonement. You think about it the same way that most Christians believe that Jesus' blood atoned for their sins. And that notion of Jesus being the ultimate sacrifice came about to basically downplay the notion that we still need to do sacrifices as we do in Ifa and other African traditional systems. But that never stopped, that our deities never told us to stop doing it. In fact, most of your highest ranking priests in the Jewish tradition, they absolutely still do sacrifices. Nothing you'll see them doing almost play for play, the same type of ritual work in their sacrificial processes as we do in the Ifa tradition. And you see how well that they made it in society and where they are, and they still do it because they understand that that's an atonement for sin. That's an also, and when I say sin, I'm not coming from the context because that concept doesn't really exist in Ifa in the same way that it does in Christianity. But again, just for contextual purposes, it's to atone for imbalance, which what Christians call sin. So if you're out of balance in one area, if you're dealing with some type of battle, for instance, and you might have to give a sacrifice of a dog to Ogun to balance those dynamics out so a wound can come and then fight for you. You are giving him something. And when you give him something, that what he accepts and what he takes and what he wants, even so at that particular time, he's gonna go to battle for you and straighten out whatever situation that you're doing. It's the same thing we do as humans, right? When you want something, you give something. You go to the bank, right? Traditionally, historically, when you went to the bank, it's changed a little bit now, but they asked for collateral before they gave you a loan because they needed something. They needed that balance. And they're just going to give you something and not have something to be able to atone for if you don't pay back that loan. They had to get something back. So it's a similar dynamic. I hope I answered your question. Yeah.
No, you did a
No, you did a
fabulous
fabulous
job.
job.
And I like the analogy about going to the bank, right? Because then it makes me think like, okay, what you're describing, someone could say is a sort of like spiritual exchange almost, right? Because
It
people say
absolutely is.
everything is energy. So on the other side, there's a whole world on the other side, right? So there's energy coming from us and coming from them. So it's an exchange of like an energetic depth that you're paying almost. I don't want to oversimplify it, but I'm just trying to make sure I fully understand it.
Understand it.
And I like that you pointed out that some of these practices people consider to be evil, but there's so much evidence of sacrifices within the Bible, right? But then it makes me think too, this is where my mind goes because I'm always trying to find a thread across different things. So going back to what I said about energy, a lot of people who have talked about the occult and talked about these darker forces, one thing they say often, and I don't know if you've dove deep into this, one thing they say often is that those forces always ask for some sort of sacrifice. They can't just give you anything without getting something from you back. They'll take it times two, right? So I'm like, so what is the difference between someone who is communicating with the Orishas, asking for something and giving them a sacrifice versus people who are they want to do something that is not for good and they're also paying a debt, also giving a sacrifice as well. What is the difference?
The process and the concepts are the same. The difference is your intention and also the consequences, right? That come from that. So definitely you always be asked for something when you're dealing with a spiritual force. Even so, like with Jesus, that requires a form of sacrifice, even for modern day practitioners. Maybe they're not giving blood sacrifice, but they give sacrifices in the form of tithes and offerings, fasting, alms, all of that's outlined in the New Testament, right? So those are forms of sacrifice too. Whenever you are giving charity, that's very, very common, especially in Islam, right? Giving charity and fasting and things like that is outlined in the Bible. It's just that a lot of modern day Christians don't adhere to those concepts in the same way that we see Muslims doing so in today's world. You're giving something. You're always going to give something, be it blood or be it sacrificing your time, your energy, your mindset, so forth and so on. It's just what you're giving, and again, the intentions behind it. So you can absolutely come, even like the principle is the principle. You can use it for good or evil. So even in E5, there is the propensity to use these forces to do evil things, right? It exists, but a true traditionalist is not going to utilize these tools for evil or malevolent works. But somebody absolutely can. It happens. People use it for the wrong thing. So they would. Some people will sacrifice humans in order to get exactly what they want. Because when we're sacrificing in Ifa, we are sacrificing to get the help that we want, but the help is still on the terms of the Orisha based on our destiny. So, for instance, let's say you want money, because that's a common thing. You need your finances to be straightened out. You go and give the offering that is asked for or required for you to get what you want. That balance is going to come, but it's going to come according to your destiny. So that doesn't mean that you're going to have $1 million just dropped in your lap just because you go and you give Ebo for your financial situation. The Orishas are going to bring the money. Usually it'll come in the form of you actually having to work extra, you getting maybe a promotion or a raise or something like that. Now, on the opposite end of that, when you're using your left hand, what they call to do evil works, then what you're talking about with people using occultic magic and practices, you use that energy and you're going to give a not so great sacrifice, right? It's going to be heavy handed. So, like I said, it could be a human sacrifice. It's very, very common. Or you're going to sell your soul or something like that because it is a real thing. And for those types of things, that's a very, very, very heavy price to pay because it's not just like any random human you're going to sacrifice. Usually, it's going to be somebody close to you, somebody that you don't want to sacrifice, right? And it's going to cause some hardships and some difficulties in that individual's life. And it's not easy, it's really impossible to break a covenant like that once you go down that path. And so you will experience some negative consequences from it. But what happens in that is what you get is that immediate reward. It will be a scenario that, well, money is just almost dropped in your lap, so to speak, right? I'm not saying it's going to fall down from heaven, just not to confuse anybody. But what I mean is the money will flow and it will come easily and it will come from a spiritual source. So it won't be something that you have to go out and work and hustle for it. When you do sacrifices in Ifa, what happens is that through like Ebo, animal sacrifice. Let me be clear. When you do an animal sacrifice at Ifa, what happens is you start to get ideas, right? Doors start to open, opportunities start to open up for you in order for you to get whatever it is you want. So with that example for money, it may be that you get a better job offer, or if you're dealing with business, for instance, you'll see more clients start to come through your door, etc. Those types of things. You still are working for that. But if it's like a human sacrifice or like in the occultic world, it will come so easily. Money just starts. And it sometimes can be very, very spiritual. Like just go somewhere, you find this kind of pot of gold, so to speak, and you get that money, but it's gonna come at a price. Sometimes even I remember when I was in West Africa, there was a story about a woman who had did a sacrifice like that, and in her dream, the spirits came to her and just started, giving her a whole lot of money. And then when she wakes up, the money is there in her house, literally, right? And so she was happy because she had done the work and all this type of stuff to get the money. But then she started to really, really suffer in her life, and she started to deal with a whole lot of things that she wanted out, but she couldn't get out. And you cannot get out when it comes to those types of things. So you either, if you try to get out, either you're gonna die or you'll go mad or something like that. A lot of people we see walking on the streets mad, so to speak. Some of them have engaged in that type of work.
As you were talking, I was thinking about all the Nigerian movies I watched as a child, and that was always the storyline. Someone decided to do some sort of sacrifice to beings that were not of the light, and eventually they ended up going mad because, like you said, it's heavy-handed and they always come to collect back. And you talked a lot about balance and just when it comes to sacrifice in general, going back to not the evil beings or the occult that we're talking about, going back to the ancestors and the Orishas, you talked about we need to balance. Is that karma that you're talking about? Is that synonymous to the word karma that we hear a lot?
It could be, excuse me, it could be karma. right? But it could just be, I mean, it would always be karma, I guess, in the sense that whatever your deeds are, whatever deeds, whether it happened yesterday or yesteryear, right? Or either it happened in ancient times with your ancestors before you even got here. So it is karma in a sense, if you want to think about it, like whatever deeds you've done. Sometimes it's not necessarily, again, what you've done. It could be from your ancestral heritage. It could be some type of imbalance in your body that you don't know about. And it's not necessarily that you've done something bad or wrong in the sense that we think about it in this world. So a lot of people, many people are violating taboos right now, and they don't know about them. Taboos are sacred restrictions in the Ifa tradition, things that you agreed to not do before you came into this earthly experience. And so it could be something very simple, right? So it could be that you're not supposed to wear a certain color. Nobody thinks about that, right? That is not part of tradition because that's not taught in Christianity. And you're walking around wearing this color, and that color has you off balance, consistently off balance. And you don't know that until you get Idafa, which is an Ifa reading, a spiritual reading. And so once you go and get that reading, you realize I'm not supposed to be wearing red. And you transition, you start wearing red, you start wearing lighter colors, white, stuff like that. And you'll see you still need to do elbow in that case because you need to now balance out all of that energy that went against, what you were supposed to be doing. And once you do the elbow and you start wearing the colors that you're supposed to wear, you are going to experience balance there. So, yes, it's karma in a sense, but I would say not karma in the sense that we tend to think about it from such a polarized perspective, like good or bad karma, right? Because I personally, even knowing what taboos are, I still wouldn't say a person is doing something wrong or bad because they're wearing red and they're not supposed to wear red unless they know. If then that's a whole different scenario. But if you don't know, like nobody can hold you at fault for something like that. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, no,
Yeah, no, it makes
it
a
makes a lot of sense. And I want to ask, so a lot of times people are curious. They go on this spiritual journey. They don't really know what they're tapping into, but they're excited. They want to talk to the Orishas, they want to talk to the ancestors and stuff. And I would assume that a lot of them are probably doing this without giving any sort of sacrifice, not knowing the right channels to go through and stuff like that. Are there consequences for talking to the ancestors or trying to communicate with the Orishas without giving them sacrifice?
there can be, right? With, I won't say without giving them sacrifice, but the consequences will come in you not really understanding the energetic pattern that you're working with. So if you want to call on Oshun, you just feel drawn to Oshun, it's perfectly fine to go and pray to Oshun. What I would not do though is go and set up an altar to Oshun. What I do not advise people to do is to go and set up an altar to Oshun or any other spirit, right? I'm just using her as an example, so I don't want anybody to take this and say, well, I can do it on the Oya because she said Oshun. But any spiritual force, don't go and set up an altar. Don't start feeding them blood. Don't start giving them offerings and other materials because you don't understand the energetic pattern. And in Ifa, in any African system anyway, in order to consecrate or bless a pot or a sacred icon unto that deity that requires blood. Okay. And so a lot of people go about, they read stuff on the internet or they read a book and they're like, I'm gonna go set up my Oshun altar and they get all these different flowers and so forth and so on. And they bring it into their space and they're like, this is Oshun's altar. Well, they don't really know what spirit they're messing with, right? And so a lot of times they set up these altars and they're inviting in the wrong spiritual forces. With the ancestors in particular, I do caution people there because you don't always know what ancestors, what spiritual forces you're dealing with. So some people just start calling on all the people from their bloodline and so forth, so on. And all of the individuals who are deceased from our bloodlines are not our ancestors. Okay. It's the ones who lived good and benevolent lives. They contributed to the community. They, 9 times out of 10, they had a biological child. If they didn't, they were required to have been responsible for taking care of a child, so forth and so on. So just because somebody was in your family line and they passed away, they're not automatically your ancestor. So you want to be careful there. I always encourage people to definitely start working with their ancestors, but understand the difference. And when you're calling on them, to invite in those good and benevolent forces so that they can help you to travel down the right path and get the information that you need. And when you get to a certain level, it's very, very important to do ancestral connection and ancestral elevation ceremonies. Elevation is so paramount because, especially for us in the diaspora, our ancestors have suffered so much, and so many of them are out of place. And what I mean by ancestral elevation, so when somebody transitions, if they didn't live a good life, if they're not automatically granted access to the ancestral realm, they're kind of stuck in a place that's not so great, right? And they're not able to help you out in the way that you want them to help you out. A lot of times people, they know this particular person that passed away. Well, for instance, my dad passed away. So I'm just going to go and start calling on my dad specifically because I know he left this earth, and so I want him to bless me. You don't know where your dad is necessarily. So if you haven't done the proper rites and rituals, that's automatic for people who are in the tradition, that when somebody passes away, they go through the proper process of situating their deceased loved one. But if you're just now coming into the tradition and you don't know all of that, if you're going to speak to your ancestors, I would say just speak to them collectively, the good and benevolent ancestors. Don't just start calling on grandma. Don't just start calling on daddy because you don't know where they are. So I would say it in that way.
Again, as I have these conversations and I think about it for myself as well, like I said, consider myself like a spiritual investigator. I'm so curious about everything and I want to know how these things work. I know that sometimes I think my intuition always tells me that it's not just something I can just jump into and say, oh, I want to try this. I want to do this. Because again, like you said, for example, people who decide to set up an altar to Oshun and slaughter an animal, they could be calling in all different types of spirits. And it will not be Oshun. It could be spirits disguising themselves as Oshun that could also lead to deeper issues. And I think there's so many people who've run into that. So I like that you kind of made that point. The other thing I want to talk about, because we're talking about ancestors and lineage and tradition and all that stuff, I hear people a lot of times say that when it comes to these things, and let me know if I'm wrong, not everyone can just decide to practice the Ifa tradition, for example, if they are not aligned with that spiritual path. So, for example, if there's a specific tradition from Ireland, there's a high chance that I'm not necessarily aligned to that tradition or spiritual path because, as it seems in this lifetime, as a Black woman, I most likely don't have any sort of spiritual or ancestral connection to Irish people, right? Or whatever spiritual traditions that they have. So I hope you're understanding what I'm trying to ask here. But it's like, how can someone who's curious about African spirituality, whether in the diaspora or in Africa, kind of figure out what tradition actually aligns with their path, with their destiny?
So that's a great point, a topic that comes up so much as far as whether the practices are closed or what have you. It's definitely based on heritage or lineage. So this is something that I always tell people, like, you have to understand that. As far as anybody being able to practice, they can, because Ifa is an oracle. So you can come to Ifa anytime you desire. But do always understand, when you're coming to Ifa, you're coming through somebody else's family lineage, not necessarily your own. And that's the case for most of us in the diaspora because we don't know the exact lineage. Even me knowing, like I told you, getting spiritual readings, knowing that Ifa was in my bloodline, even going back to practice Ifa right now, I don't know if I'm dealing with somebody that is a family line rather that is actually part of my blood lineage, right? It's okay if I choose to practice with somebody else's lineage. It would be no different, really, if you had like a Yoruba orphan, right? And or she decided, or I won't say decided, but they went to live with a Yoruba family that practices the Ifa tradition. They're orphan, they have Yoruba heritage, known Yoruba heritage, and they start to practice Ifa. That's not their bloodline, but they're practicing under someone else. So it's okay. It's not bad. It's not wrong to do that. But there's a certain level of respect that has to come with that as well. Because this is the thing. A lot of people, I think, they expect Ifa to be very similar to Christianity, and it's not. Yes, there are foundational ground rules. The Odu applies to everybody, and the foundation of the Odu is about Iwapele, living in gentle character, right? So those things are going to apply to everybody, but there are certain communal taboos, familiar taboos, etc., that is going to apply to a particular family line. And so when you go in and you start practicing with someone, they may tell you certain taboos that are present there within their lineage, and you might start to adhere to them. There's nothing wrong, especially if they don't violate your, I should say, particularly if they don't violate your own personal taboos or something like that. So you have to keep those particular dynamics in mind. So I sit on that fence. Some people I know, they say, "Oh, you can't practice this, close practice, so forth and so on." But that's not my understanding of it. That's not the understanding that I have been given by people who I practice the tradition with currently, or even in the past, people who I've consulted with that have talked about the tradition and saying, who can integrate into it. I just believe that there is a strong level of respect that you need to have for it, and to have for the diversity that exists within it. Because somebody might be talking about something, saying, this is what they believe, or this is what they do, or what have you, in their house or their Ile, and that's what they do, right? And you can't come in and, well, I heard this over here and I was told this over there, right? Because that's what a lot of people do. You're wrong because this is, and it's not necessarily, for the most part, an issue of right or wrong, because it can be so different. It can look different from house to house.
And I think that makes a lot of sense because, I mean, if you think about it nowadays, especially since we live in such a globalized world where so many people from different cultures are mixing and there's so many mixed children out there, right? People from different heritages, different backgrounds. There's a lot of us in the diaspora, right, that we're taking from our land and brought into different lands, right? And so to kind of say that it's a closed tradition, I think there's a little bit more nuance there. So I appreciate you for kind of highlighting that nuance. So something I wanted to say is that I noticed that you say Ifa tradition versus religion. Is that
Mhm.
intentional? If so,
Mm,
why?
yes. So typically when I speak about it, I will say Ifa tradition. You probably will see me write religion from here and there, especially online, because it's part of SEO for people to understand and to get to the content that they need to get to. It is a tradition, in my opinion, and a lot of it has to do with what I was talking about, being different from line to family line. Um, Religion is full of dogma, in my opinion. Don't do this. You shouldn't do this. You shouldn't do that, etc., etc., etc. And those dynamics are applicable to everybody, right? So you go into the Bible, you look at the Ten Commandments, and it's like this whole list of don't. Well, yes, those are just basic things related to human integrity, do unto others, so to speak. However, again, going back to that notion of taboos, taboos are so individual. So what might be okay for me to do might not be okay for you to do. And that's what spirituality is about. It's about the individual destiny. Religion is about dogma. It's about putting everybody in this box, in my opinion. And we all got to do it this way because that's what somebody told us to do. And so I oftentimes say tradition. Tradition. You may hear me say religion here and there, but I look at it as a tradition. It's the way of old, the way of the ancient.
And speaking about destiny, something that's very important within a lot of African traditions, because we're only talking about one. I just want to make the audience aware that we're only talking about the Ifa tradition. There's so many different traditions. I'm sure there's a lot of overlap, but we're talking about the Ifa tradition specifically. But just in general, I know when it comes to African spirituality, divination is a huge thing. It's a really big thing. So, can you kind of define what divination is and why is it important for the tradition and why is it incorporated so heavily?
Because it is all about understanding your destiny. Like everything, every time you get a reading, an Odu is generated. The Odu is going to tell you what's going on in your life at that time. It will likely give you some warnings. It may give you some taboos. It's not everybody. Every time you get a reading, you're going to get these dynamics because everybody's reading is different. Depends on the Odu that comes out. It's going to tell you the things that you need to be doing to handle your scenario right then and there. And it can also tell you some things that you need to do to deal with your situation in the future, as far as you needing to connect with a particular Orisha, as far as you needing to initiate, so forth and so on. So it's all about gaining bit by bit more information about your destiny. Now, that being said, people born in the tradition at very young ages, not exactly at birth, it's like a few days after, they're going to get what they call a destiny reading to give them an overview of the type of lessons and the things that they are going to have to learn, the type of things that they're going to go through, et cetera, et cetera. However, they continuously get Ifa divination throughout their life, even those who understand their destiny from birth, because the readings are going to give you more in-depth information about what path you need to take in order to get to your destiny, right? So it could be you're going to have your, when you get initiated, rather, you're going to get your life odus and all of those types of things, and your life taboos, I meant to say. You're going to get your life taboos when you get initiated into Ifa, etc. But as you go along your journey, you still have to get readings because you may have some temporary odus that show up for you. It may be that you're not supposed to go out late at night during a certain time frame. You're not
Sorry,
supposed. Go ahead.
can I ask you just to clarify what an ODU is for the people who are listening?
Absolutely. So it's a sacred verse that is generated during an Ifa reading. And thank you for asking that. So that's what happens whenever you get a reading. There is a verse, a scripture, if you will, to kind of put it in context. But these are wise sayings and notions about everything that the human is going to experience throughout their life, right? And so all of the old dues are already have been laid out since the old time. There's a codified system that goes into place when the reading is done. And so they're going to generate an old do based on this a geomancy system, just to put it kind of simple. It's based on a system of numbers and things like that. And so once you get the reading, you are going to be told this Odu or this sacred verse or this sacred script, etc., applies to your life at this particular time. And it can come with so many different things, right? It could tell you that you're close to sickness, you're close to death, and what you need to do about it. It could even come with some permanent taboos, especially if it reveals that you're connected to a specific Orisha. And so you need to start walking in alignment with what's going on with that particular Orisha. Things like that. So like Obatala, for instance, the king of the white cloth. Obatala children should not be wearing red, full red colors. Not that you can't wear it at all, but you should be wearing full red clothing. Right? That's a permanent taboo no matter when you get it if you're a child of Obatala. That's how that works. So for somebody that's coming into the tradition later on in life, somebody converting or reverting, if you will, to the tradition, you don't know those types of things. So you're going to be getting that information through Ifa divination. That's why it's so very, very important. A lot of times people come to get a reading when they're going through something. So like, what do I need to do? I'm having this problem, so forth and so on. So of course you can get a reading out then, but in traditional society, it's very common for people to get Ifa divination like at least every 30 days.
And just to clarify, the divination here is it's the readings that you're talking about, right? The readings of kind of looking at the person's life, assessing what their destiny is. And again, speaking about destiny, is it tied, is that such a big piece of the tradition in knowing oneself so that they can walk the right path for their life because they're trying to break a reincarnation cycle? Does Ifa touch on reincarnation and the need to come back to learn lessons and overcome certain taboos, if you will?
So the whole emphasis of the tradition is about your destiny. It's a way of being, it's a way of life so that you can live better, you can understand your destiny, you can walk in and fulfill your destiny. Because not everybody's going to fulfill their destiny. There's so many different things that could be blocking that particular process. So again, that's why we do the divination. That's why you do the ritual work to balance out things so that you can fulfill your destiny, etc. Now, there is a notion of reincarnation, not in the same way that we see in like the Hindu traditions and things like that. And if you're believed to reincarnate back into your own family line. So even a lot of the Yoruba names are actually based on that. So like Babatunde, I think it means father has returned or something like that. And so you have like a lot of the names that are basically saying which family member just came back through this individual, this infant that was born. And so obviously you are going to be tasked with working out any karma from that past existence and walking forward and trying to achieve your destiny during this one.
Beautiful. I love talking about destiny and everything related to that. And speaking of destiny, I heard you on a podcast say that Christianity, since it's been introduced to a lot of Black people, especially in the United States, to adopt Christianity, you say it doesn't really do much for us and might be one of the reasons why we haven't made as much strides as we should have as a collective. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. So it divorces us from our knowledge system, our ancient wisdom, just like we were just saying about the Ifa divination. It's about learning your destiny. It's about understanding what works with you, your taboos and things like that. It's funny that you've been asked because I was thinking about that heavily this weekend, just how we as a collective we suffer so much because we don't know who we are. We don't. When I say who we are, I'm not just talking about your bloodline and your ancestors and who you came from. I mean you as a person. You don't know who you are. You don't know your destiny. You don't know why you were brought into this earth. Because in the Western system, we're even taught destiny is more so about occupation. When somebody even comes and say, "What's my destiny?" A lot of time they're asking, "What should I be doing as far as work going?" That's not the same thing. That's not what we mean by destiny. Destiny is the lessons that you're going to learn, the experiences that you're going to have in this life. Now, everybody's destiny reading can look a little bit different. Somebody's destiny reading may say this person is going to be really, really famous or something like that. Or this person is going to work in a particular profession if that is like what they were really, really, really meant to do occupationally. But even so, those dynamics are integrated into the lessons, the knowledge that they have to have in order to balance themselves out, in order to get into a space of peace and harmony in this life. That's what it's about. We're divorced from that notion as a people group, especially African Americans specifically. I'm gonna speak for African Americans because I came from that background. Black American, African American, whatever you call yourself, right? So this is not about the nomenclature. It's about the experience of our people group. We have lost so much knowledge. We don't know who we are. We're serving a God of from a people group who enslaved you. And I always say they came and they enslaved you. Do you really think that they're going to give you a God that's going to save you? It doesn't make sense. So we find ourselves in a space where we are forever perpetually just going into a blind cycle. We don't have enlightenment. We don't have wisdom. I'm a firm believer. and doing what works for you. So I don't tell anybody to stop practicing Christianity because I work with a number of clients who still practice Christianity along with Ifa. And if that's working for you, if it's helping you, let it do. Even so, if you're just dealing with Christianity, but most of the time, Black people in America, African Americans. Again, I'm not speaking of Caribbean islands or South Central Americans. I'm speaking specifically about African Americans, Black Americans here in the U.S. Even in the church, everything is geared towards financial prosperity, right? That's the emphasis. And success is you made it. You make a certain amount of money, you can live in a certain house, you can drive a certain vehicle, etc. There are plenty of people who have that notion of success as Black people, and they still suffer because they're not fulfilling their destiny. They don't know what their destiny is. And until we get that part right, we will forever be on the bottom. We will forever be on the bottom as a people group because we don't know who we are. Other people groups do. Like you take the Hispanic culture, for instance, they've been practicing the Lucami, the Santerias, the Espiritismo, the Palo, etc. They've been doing this for ever, right? So they got their derived practices. A lot of them still practice Christianity, Catholicism alongside with those traditions, but we see how those people groups are growing and really taking over in a lot of parts because they've held on to their traditions. We see it with the Chinese. Chinese integrate so much into ancestral veneration and serving their deities. And we see how strong their society has become and continues to become. We see that with Indians who practice Hinduism, right? They're still honoring their gods. Most of the CEOs in America of the top corporations, Google, Amazon, etc., are Indian from the subcontinent India. I'm not referring to Native American Indians here. They are from the continent. What do you call it? They're from India, Asia. Okay, we see this dynamic all around. Other people groups continuously come up while we continuously stay down because we're not connected to our ancestors. We're not connected to our spirits, our gods. We're the only people group that's still worshiping something that doesn't look like us.
We can talk about this all day. And I think this is a very important thing that you're saying because I think part of the reason why I'm constantly trying to get the answers is because I resonated with what you said at the very beginning, which is the deeper you went into Christianity, the more questions you had, and you couldn't get the answers there. So I think that also ties in with just a sense of knowing that my spiritual, what's the word for when you're like the thing that you're following, that's your light, my spiritual
Spiritual
compass.
path. Oh.
Yes, spiritual path, spiritual compass.
Mhm.
um Something was off there. I needed to know
Need
more,
to
and I'm
know more, and
still
I'm
learning
still
more.
learning
So I
more.
think it's very important that you're bringing this up. And just to clarify, when you say destiny, are you also talking about what people consider to be purpose? Because I know that's something people are always searching for as well. Is destiny the same as purpose here, or is it a little bit more nuanced than that?
I think your purpose is integrated into your destiny. So
Mm.
your destiny is like the path, the lessons, the things like that that you're going to learn. Your purpose is like what you are going to do, the major impact, I should say, that you are going to have based on the pathway that you take. So somebody's purpose could be to be a mother, right? They could just be here to be the best mother that they can be. And they're going to have different experiences that guide them and shape them and help them to be that, right? And some people, their purpose may be to be a great leader, to change the mindset and to help transform society on a very global or collective level. Okay, and then so their destiny, their path is going to shape them so that they get those lessons, they get the information, the knowledge that come from the background, so forth and so on, to help them to achieve that.
Whereas destiny is a little bit more bigger than that because purpose is constantly changing, but destiny is constant. I can't think of an example of what someone's destiny would be, but I know it's on an individual level, but also ties into the collective, which is what I think you were just talking about.
So yeah, so destiny is the path, and it's like it's so many things embedded in that. So like your destiny could be that you're going to fight a whole lot of battles, right? And people don't want to hear that. But of course, it could be part of your destiny that you gotta fight a lot of battles. So you may have like Ogun being my head Orishas, so like definitely I've been through that path. You got Ogun govern because Ogun is gonna help you fight those battles and win. And so you have to learn how to fight. It could be that something within you, you incarnated into this being, like you came in where you were timid or shy and you don't know how to fight, right? And so your path would be to learn how to fight, learn how to take up for yourself, your family members, and other people who are downtrodden in society. And so you get that Ogun energy to help you to achieve that. That's part of it. It's more nuanced than that, but that's just one example.
I think everything we just talked about is very important, especially for it's important for everyone because this is knowledge that I think is important for us to learn and understand. And I'm still going to dive deeper into these topics, but also it's very important for Black people, especially what you just said in the last 10 minutes of our conversation. I think a lot of people, whether you're in the diaspora or on the continent, are trying to kind of get to a place where they're reconnecting to ancestral traditions. There's a lot of push towards that on a collective level and on an individual level. Like I even think about my name. I'm named after my grandmother, and I think about my parents' lives and where they grew up. There's this hunger to kind of know how they grew up, how they were raised, what traditions that they had, and I think that's not just on a individual level because I want to know my lineage, but there's a spiritual component to that as well. And I think a lot of Black people are feeling that call, right? It's like we're being called to search deeper and go deeper into who we are. And we're all going to take different paths to figure out our spirituality and our destiny. But I think it's important to have these conversations because it's going to trigger a lot of things for people, right? So before we get into how people can work with you if they have questions, I'm sure a lot of people listening to this are probably going to have more questions for you. I want to talk about if you shifted in perspective on anything recently.
Recent, what do you mean by that? Like, give me a time frame.
Okay, that's a great question. So, because I call the show Shifting Dimensions, part of the reason why you did that is because I feel like we're constantly shifting. Now, we just talked about a huge shift that you had in your life from Christianity into the Ifa tradition, right? And we just talked about your whole story embedded with what the tradition is, etc., right? So, I think we're always shifting, and it could be really deep, profound stuff. It could also be very basic stuff too. Like, for example, I, over the last year, went from not caring for pets or animals. Not that I hated them or anything. I just could never see myself being like obsessed with cats. My sister got a cat. I looked over the cat and my heart opened in ways that I didn't think would open. And now I really love cats. So I just want to know if you had any sort of recent profound shifts, and you kind of have to be the one to determine the if it was 5 years ago or a week or 2 weeks ago.
I would say, yeah. So on the business front, I started to do live streams more. And I didn't want to do that for the longest, right? And some people like to kind of encourages me and I work with, they kept saying, you need to do live streams, you need to do live streams. And I didn't it just wasn't something I was enthusiastic about. And I started doing live streams and I fell in love with that format because it just opens up a whole nother gateway when I can communicate with my audience in real time and they say how much they enjoy it as well. It's a whole nother dynamic than when I prepare to do a video and I sit down and I talk about what I think that they want to hear. Or even so they've asked me questions and sometimes I do prepare a video from that, but still maybe I'm not tackling 100% of their question, right? And so when I get into a live stream, I can get really deep and granular into their questions because I might say something and they want to know more. And even so, the conversation can go so many different directions and not even so just them learning from me, then I get an opportunity to learn a whole lot more from them as well because the conversations are just so vibrant and dynamic. So I would say that's my shift.
Thank you for sharing that. I'm working on that shift as well because I keep feeling like I want to connect with my audience more as well. And I tried live on TikTok and I was so freaked out and I got out of it. But you have to do the things that scare you. That's where the growth happens. So thank you for sharing that. Where can people find you? I know you have a podcast. I know you have a website. You have different services as well. So how can people get in contact with you or find your podcast to get more information?
My website is the best place to locate me. I prefer everybody just to go there because all of the links and everything is valid and they point to my actual stuff. So www.asanee44.com. That's where you can find me.
Beautiful. I will leave that in the show notes. Thank you, Dr. Sani, for gracing us with your presence on Shifting Dimensions. It's been a pleasure.
Same here. You take care.